In the last few years, the relationship between the US and Russia has hit the lowest point since the end of the Cold War, argues our guest here. While other US presidents attempted to reset these relations or find a way to get along with Russia, the Biden administration seeks to reach predictable strategic stability. Did the Geneva Summit yield the desired results? What is the future of the Russia-US relations? That's what Dr. Lena Sortsko-Harned will explore as we take a look at the Biden-Putin Summit in Geneva. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spegg, I'm the vice president at the JES, and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Before we get to her presentation, a bit about the presenter. Dr. Sortsko-Harned is an assistant teaching professor of political science at Penn State Barron. Her primary research interests are in the field of comparative politics. She is the author of a number of papers dealing with issues of nationalism and ethnic conflict, identity politics, electoral politics, comparative democratization, and political behaviors in post-communist states of Eastern Europe. Her co-authored book, Post-Soviet Legacies and Conflicting Values in Europe, Generation Y, was published in December of 2017 and examines the intergenerational conflict and its consequences in post-Soviet Ukraine and Russia. For a fuller bio, head over to our website, jeserie.org. Folks, Dr. Sortsko-Harned will offer some insight and opening remarks, and then we're going to open up the conversation and the discussion. I'm going to ask some questions. She's got some that we'll address as well, but we're also looking for questions from you. We're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below of this Facebook post. Now, if you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this program, still send us your questions, your comments to keep this conversation going. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lena Sortsko-Harned back to the JES digital stage. Lena, thanks for joining us here.
Thank you for having me. As always, it's a pleasure, and I'm very happy to be talking to you again. At the times of summits, it seems that we always have these conversations to unpack the big geopolitical conversations. And of course, this particular summit was so widely anticipated and so talked about prior to it happening. It was sort of expected as a big piece of political theater, and I don't think we were disappointed. But in the sense that it was a piece of political theater. But in the sense of what we actually achieved, this is sort of what we're here for, to see where it takes us. So what's the, in your description, as you read of my talk, right, of where we are, it's sort of interesting to see and put this particular summit in a more historical context. And it would be interesting to actually look at this in a even broader context, right? Because as you say, the relationship between Russia and the United States is at the lowest since the Cold War. And it's very interesting to sort of look at even the meetings during the Cold War, like the meeting even between Khrushchev and Nixon, when Nixon was still a vice president. And the relationship between, for instance, the meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan. And you can see that even at the times of Cold War, the relationship, the meeting, the tone of the meeting was a heck of a lot warmer than the relationship and the meeting style and how the body language unfolded between President Biden and President Putin this year. But what was also interesting about this particular summit from the perspective of optics and political theater is also the sort of lack of gimmicks in some way, right? Because you remember the infamous reset button, as we talked about, right? This has been brought up numerous times. There was an attempt to reset relationship under the Obama administration. Then there was the summit between President Trump and President Putin, and of course, which ended with the big present of the soccer ball and all kinds of other sort of gimmicky moments in that particular meeting. But this particular meeting was the summit between Biden and Putin was a very different affair, much more subdued, shorter than everybody had anticipated, right? Instead of 5 hours that people expected the meeting to go on, as reporters were expecting it to go on, the meeting wrapped up in 3. And there's no joint press conference that followed in the end, which is also a very important message. There is no invitation that followed for the heads of the governments and heads of states to visit each other in their respective capitals, which is sometimes is also the norm between such meetings. So there is a lot to be said about the manner and the tone in which this meeting was conducted itself in terms of where the relationship really is. So I wanted to take us very quickly through some agenda items of sort of where are we then? If this was then the expectation of this particular meeting, and perhaps the tone of it then was properly set in the sense that, again, this was not a reset of any kind. This was not an attempt to get along in any way, but rather it really was an attempt to find this stable relationship. So was this achieved? Was this stable relationship found in a sense? On one hand, the approach to a stable relationship, I think, was probably a correct approach to this meeting, because in some way, idealistic things like resetting relationship with Russia or getting along with Russia are idealistic in a sense, right? In the sense that those were idealistic types of agendas or goals, right? They were more sort of trying to be friends with Russia, whereas Biden administration's approach to sort of find this strategic relationship that is more predictable is probably more in line of the international relations, especially, you know, in the countries, between countries that have such low point in their relationship. So where are we then? Was this stable and predictable relationship found? Well, on one hand, the big expectations between these two leaders as they were going into the meeting was that they will be defining red lines for each other. So did they succeed in defining their red lines? I would say yes. And the thing is that this finding the red lines, defining red lines for each other, I think they kind of knew them before they went in. So from some relationship, from some perspective, what have we learned new about these red lines? Well, probably not much. If anything, we were reaffirmed in the red lines that we knew already existed. We were reaffirmed in the sense that, you know, what United States messaged about cybersecurity, what United States and President of the United States messaged about human rights position, vis-a-vis the agenda of Vladimir Putin, who also several times last week had a chance to communicate directly to the world what his red lines are, what the red lines of the Russian Federation are, including the situation in Ukraine, including the situation with NATO. And Putin had a chance to communicate those things twice, right, to American public, once in his interview to NBC prior to the summit itself, where he very clearly stated his position. So again, I'm hard pressed to believe that President Biden and his team did not realize or didn't know or expected some new red lines to emerge from this summit. So they sort of knew where they were, and they were reaffirmed again by Putin's press conference in the end, where he basically repeated not only his mannerism and style of delivery of his messages that we saw in the NBC interview, but also the content of them, that they're sort of preservation of sovereignty that Russia continues to hold sacred, in the sense that basically Russia will do what Russia finds in its best interest. And that is probably the sort of the upshot of the red lines. They know, both presidents know, both administrations know sort of where their red lines are. The question now is, where are we going to go from here with those red lines defined? So another question on the agenda was cybersecurity. Did they achieve anything on the cybersecurity? I would say probably not, right? There was questions asked of both presidents about this. Vladimir Putin has a very strong position that Russia is not the source of cyber insecurity around the world, that Russia actually seeks to position itself as the country that seeks to find international cooperation in the matters of cybersecurity within itself. The document of which Putin has spoke both in his interview and then later referenced in his press conference after the summit also sort of raises a lot of questions about the terms of that cooperation that Russia is proposing for the West. So here, I would say we didn't get far. Nuclear disarmament, and this is probably one of the more important points about that stability, right? That strategic stability. That yes, in the joint statement after the summit, both reaffirmed their commitment to nuclear disarmament, both reaffirmed their sort of agreement to continue talking in that direction, and that is probably as good as we're gonna get. At least in that particular big line. And it's a big achievement, actually. It's nothing to be sneezed at, because again, we are dealing with two great nuclear superpowers, whether, it's just a matter of fact. And the fact that they are talking to each other, right? They already sort of are agreeing to have that, at least that conversation under control. Should be a good sign for the world, right? Now that they can concentrate on other things, at least in this case, they have some kind of agreement. On prisoner exchange, right? There has been some conversation, nothing definite has been settled. Both presidents said that that issue was addressed. Vladimir Putin, of course, takes a very sort of blasé attitudes about this, but it's one of these smaller issues, and I hate to use the word smaller issues because by no stretch of imagination is it the small issues for people held in prison, but nonetheless, right, this is one of these geopolitically issues that might have softened the relationship where some kind of continuity might have been found. But again, we did not get a clear answer at the end of the day whether or not this is going to be resolved. Excuse me. Another issue on the agenda was diplomatic relations, whether or not the diplomatic relations is going to be resumed. And this is probably the most low-hanging fruit on the agenda, right? It's the easiest thing that the two of them could have talked about. And not to sound cynical, but seriously, right? Sending diplomats to each other's countries is always a good step in the right direction, but also, right, it gives an opportunity to, again, for the Russian Federation to withdraw their ambassador next time they're unhappy about something. So again, it's a joke. I'm not trying to be cynical, but there it is. But at least there we do have an agreement that they're going to be a resumed diplomatic relationship that have been severed in the last few years. Another one, Ukraine and Belarus, missing an L there. They were sort of lumped together, and this agenda, which, for me as a Ukrainian expert, is a little bit of a letdown. But again, there is no agreement there either. If anything, we heard very little about both of these. And it seems that this is where those big red lines run. Right, this is one of the issues in both of these countries: Russian involvement in both of these countries, Russian interest in both of these countries is a very much a red line for Vladimir Putin. He continues to reiterate his line on the fact of defending Belarusian dictator Lukashenko, and of course on Ukraine sovereignty. There's not much further conversation, right? He reiterated one more time his line about following the Minsk agreements and so on, which, we can go a little bit further in detail to explain what the disagreement really is there, that, all sides discuss Minsk agreements when it comes to peace in Ukraine. The problem is that everybody understands it a little differently with good reason. So again, no agreement there. Big one, another one, human rights was supposed to be on discussion. And this was a big one, right? And given again in connection to Belarus, and also with the arrest of the journalist who is now held and paraded in front of media by Lukashenko regime and held in prison. As well as, of course, the infamous imprisonments, outlawing of the opposition group of Alexei Navalny in Russia, the terrible news about not just poisoning of Alexei Navalny himself, but also numerous poisoning, successful and unsuccessful, around Russia in the last couple of weeks. There's been sort of this big tide of uncovering suspected poisonings, right, that people were not even aware of, right? So it's much more spread problem in Russia than we might have even expected. So this was supposed to be a big issue to bring up. It was brought up, but was there agreement found? Absolutely not. Now, of course, did any sane analyst believe that out of the summit will come out that, you know, Russia will agree to surrender Crimea, let Navalny go, and stop being naughty in every possible way around the world. Absolutely not. This was not an expectation. But again, we were reaffirmed again in those red lines and in those stances that the countries have taken. And finally, I threw it out, there's another topic on the agenda, might have been or expected was to be sort of Nord Stream conversation, right? And this is the infamous gas pipeline that will connect Russia to Germany through the Baltic Sea, right? Bypassing Eastern Europe altogether. And on one hand, the big controversy about this, of course, is there's a rift between NATO allies about this to start with. United States has sanctioned Nord Stream several times, starting in 2019, then again in 2020, then again reaffirmed its sanctions again earlier this year. And then, of course, in March, following the agreement for this summit, the State Department decided to withdraw these sanctions altogether, raising all kinds of eyebrows and concerns for the world. So it might have, you know, it was a matter of sort of conversation whether or not this can be discussed a little further. But of course, there was not even a mention of this, neither in the press release nor in press briefings that both presidents did afterwards, nor do we know that anything was said about Nord Stream at all during the 3-hour summit that they had. So, and again, this agenda that I have here is not by any stretch of imagination all-inclusive, but it's very extensive. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why the summit was so anticipated, because it had a lot of things that the two leaders were expected to address. But I think in the end of the day, summit left us with as much questions as we went that we were going into it, right? So was this a success? Did we get the stable, predictable relationship? The thing is, right, that one of the things that I find as an analyst of Russian foreign policy that I find a bit frustrating, especially since 2017 or even 2015, is that Russia is portrayed as this wild card, as unpredictable player in international relations. As a matter of fact, on my interview with a reporter last week, I was asked, how should US handle wild card countries like Russia? And my response is, let's stop calling it the wild card. Let's stop thinking about Russia as unpredictable player. They are quite predictable. If we understand their logic. And the thing is that last week we had ample opportunity to understand Vladimir Putin's logic. As a matter of fact, in his press conference after the summit, one thing that he said that I actually agreed with, can't believe I'm saying those words, but there they are. He actually called out a reporter who also called him out on this unpredictability. And he said, listen, stop treating Russia as unpredictable, because in his mind, there is a logic behind their actions. And he actually said, we are predictable, we are adequate, right? We're responding adequately. Now, of course, in Russian language, adequacy also refers to sane, right? As in logical and sane. So I would question how adequate in that sense Russian responses are, but there's logic behind them, in the sense that at least since invasion of Crimea and since the war started in Ukraine, we now know very well where Russian government is, what their position on world affairs is. There are definite lines that they are going to be very protective of. And they have been very consistent in following those lines. And I think it's probably a positive direction that Biden administration has abandoned the hopes of finding some kind of peaceable, and as Biden said himself, it's not about trust, it's about whether or not we can do business with one another, if we can find points of agreement. And I think it's probably a step in the right direction in dealing with Russia, understanding their logic, not necessarily being sympathetic to that logic, right? There's a big difference between understanding somebody's behavior and somebody's logic and then agreeing with those positions. But nonetheless, stop treating it as sort of unpredictable and saying, oh my goodness, can you believe what Russia did in the Black Sea? Yes, I can believe it. Yes, I can believe, because now since 2014, since occupation of Crimea, yeah, we can believe those things. We can believe and expect those types of aggressive behaviors. Was this summit really as good as it can be expected? Yeah, probably. Probably. Again, did we learn something new? we were basically reaffirmed in what we knew already, which again, in the sense of international relations, is not a, I would urge folks from making judgments of good or bad, right? It's positive development in the sense that we know where we stand. Everybody knows where they stand after this particular meeting, and it probably was a necessary step in that direction, that it sent an important message that leaders are willing to speak to each other, they're willing to have the type of conversation, continue to have those conversations, but there are certain things and certain differences between them that are irreconcilable. One other question that was sort of raised by the summit and prior to the summit and some of the observations was, if we are going for the stable and predictable relationship, are we really talking about something like resurrecting Kissingerian style realpolitik, right? Of sort of finding linkages between the positions of different countries. One of explanations of this particular style of politics could have been seen as, right, putting aside your ideological conversations, ideological disagreements, right? I mean, that was the point of Kissinger style politics to start with, that instead of arguing about ideologies, let's try to find cool, level-headed approach to the problems in front of us. Can we find moments where we can agree? Did the summit give us an inkling that that's a possibility? I am hard-pressed to say that it has arrived at that point. On one hand, because in some areas, yes, agreement might be found, but the problem continues to be that both, and we were reaffirmed about this again in both presidents' press conferences afterwards, they have very different interpretations of the world and very different sort of interpretation of the facts, which is even more terrifying. Right? If you listen carefully to Vladimir Putin's question and answer, it really raises questions in terms of, are we really even speaking the same language, right? When he is asked about let's say, the hijacking of the airplane, of Ryanair airplane by Belarusian government, his response is, well, what about that one time when, on orders of the Americans, the plane carrying Hugo Chavez was stopped in Europe? And you may have to ask yourself, but what about the question that we asked you, right? And this whataboutism that we hear about in the last week when it comes to Vladimir Putin's responses, and we heard it in his CNN interview as well, really sends sort of a strong message to the fact that there might be, it's hard to deal with realpolitik with a leader that attempts to evade the questions directly, right? So finding those points of connections, however small they are, would be great, such as, let's say, nuclear disarmament where we are. But on other points, that kind of finding those linkages might be more difficult. So is this a return then to sort of this Cold War approach? It's very interesting to think about in those terms, because this is, again, not the question that I just made up, but it's a question that someone has asked me before about whether or not, and this question has been popping up since 2015, actually, since the occupation of Crimea, whether or not we're in this new Cold War stage. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's an appropriate framework of mind, probably not necessarily. But it's interesting, and in some cases, I think we are probably at the more of the standstill with Russia than we were during the Cold War, how ridiculous it might sound. But at the same time, there are sort of big differences between these two historical events and what we're going through right now, where Russia and United States find themselves. I think the time here will tell again how the relationship develops, as the proof is in the pudding. What this summit actually leads us to. But one of the interesting parts is that one of my big objections to comparing this to Cold War has been the lack of this ideological disagreement. However, the summit has pointed out to something, or at least the statements that were coming from President Biden have pointed out that perhaps, at least on Biden's side, there is now a perception that there might be an ideological disagreement. And that ideological disagreement is between survival of democracy, right, and democratic governance vis-a-vis authoritarianism. And that is a very important conversation to be had. And again, as a political scientist, as someone who's looked at this and studied this for a number of years, I've tended to see Russian foreign policy in some ways through that lens as well, right? This Russian, especially Vladimir Putin's regime's attempt to justify, preserve, and continue and support authoritarian regimes, not only domestically, but world over, right? Sort of more of these friendly regimes, as he calls them. So yeah, there might be something to it. And I think there is, right, to this framing of this conversation in some ideological terms. The problem with that, of course, is that it's fantastically difficult conversation. And we might find ourselves again in a lockdown of ideological disagreements that are going to be very difficult to surpass. In this particular conversation, let me just give you an example of this conversation of human rights. I think one of the interesting things that came out of that press conference by President Biden was his affirmation one more time, right? That United States is a country of human rights. That is a country based on the idea, based on the ideal of human dignity, right? And human rights. Of course, it shouldn't surprise you that that particular statement has been picked up by cynics world over to point out United States' own hypocrisy, to suggest that, look, it only suits United States to talk about human rights when it suits United States, look at its own record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the very same time, right? So on one hand, that kind of conversation is not gonna win the adversary, right? The adversary has already made up their mind. Russian propaganda has made a field day out of that conversation of hypocrisy of United States on the issue of human rights. But at the very same time, why it is so important to talk about that is that there are people right now world over who needed to hear that message, needed to hear that reaffirmation in United States, you betcha, but also overseas. And those people overseas who are, giving up their lives, who are fighting real struggles, people who are in prison, people who have been sort of fighting for their life, they needed to hear the reaffirmation that there is a support from United States government for the human rights records. So again, this ideological disagreement, I think it is there. Will it breach the ideological conversation, breach the divide? Probably not. But is it important to talk about it? Yeah. And final question that I wanted to bring up in this conversation that also sort of makes me chuckle, and it's kind of a joke question that I seem to get quite a bit again from reporters more specifically, is like, so who won this summit, right? Who won? Who came out on top? Well, the thing is, again, it depends on who you ask, depends on what side of the coin you land, from what perspective you look. You better believe it that the Russian propaganda has declared Vladimir Putin's victory before he even left for the summit, before his plane took off from Moscow for Geneva. We can probably make an argument, and I've made this argument before, that for Vladimir Putin to have this summit already is a huge win, right? To be the final stop of the big European tour of number of very important summits on Biden's agenda. That's a big win. That is reaffirmation to Vladimir Putin and to his domestic public more specifically that, listen, we are a great superpower that we need to be taken into account. But at the same time, in terms of their performance of the two leaders and so on, it's I would be hard pressed to actually sort of answer this, who came out on top, who won. There's not really a clear winner to be determined. I think a lot of this conversation will have to be had as we go along to see what actual tangible results we have from these conversations. So on that, I am going to stop here with my own questions that I had and see if anyone else has any questions on this.
So Dr. Sorsko-Harnett, I want to thank you for that great overview and recap of what's happened. Appreciate your insights, your analysis on that, and a good reminder to folks, we are taking questions in the comment section on this Facebook post. So if you have them, leave them there. I want to pick up right where you left off, because I think that sometimes we tend to view these summits as, well, who won? It's more of a wrestling match than a summit rather than a discussion. And I think that takes us back to one of the things you were talking about at the beginning, that this was perhaps more positional than transactional. It wasn't as if both showed up wanting to get something directly out of it. It seemed to be getting together and being face to face. And President Biden put an emphasis on that, of meeting him in person and being there. You talked about some of the criticisms of giving President Putin that platform. Reaction here in the States, GOP has been a little critical of giving that amount of space and that amount of oxygen to Russia. But overall, as we see ourselves, a week removed from this, how are Biden's counterparts in the House, in the Senate, making sense of this as we still unpack the summit and look forward? What would you say the national reaction's been so far from those with Biden in DC?
That's a very good question, because again, as you say, it's a very politicized issue, right? Russia always is politicized issue. In the last few years, it has been even more so, with good reason. And of course, it's no matter what you do in terms of giving Russia some space, you will be criticized. It's very interesting, actually, that the analysis of, let's say, Trump administration, right? We can say very same thing, in the sense that why Trump administration had to be tough on Russia on sanctions, right? Something that he had mentioned numerous times. Well, because he had basically painted himself into a corner, was painted into a corner by the allegations of Russian meddling in the elections, right? So any kind of weakness on Russia would have been and had been perceived as tremendous give up. Yes, absolutely. So there is quite a bit of criticism that Biden has received upon his, even prior to his going to Geneva, on meeting with Vladimir Putin and on some of the actions. So for instance, of course, the Nord Stream sanctions. There has been huge way from GOP, and it's been actually bipartisan criticism, let's be honest here. But more specifically, some members of GOP have claimed that Biden has sort of sold out on this very important issue in order to gain admissions, basically, to the summit, right? To give Putin an upper hand, or give him an inducement for this particular meeting. So, Nord Stream 2 is probably one of these conversations. And again, Ukraine is another one. Belarus is another one that, there's not much was gained. And of course, there will be criticism. Absolutely. So we can absolutely see that.
And I want to go to the audience questions and pick up right there, because you mentioned Ukraine. We talked about some of the post-Soviet regions around there, around the area. And somebody in the audience has a question in regards to that, asking, are we able to curb Putin's geopolitical aggression in these regions near and in the former Soviet states? The region's security has to be a concern. So I want to ask for your reaction on that, of moving out of the summit, as we're trying to find a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. How do we think regionally in that area, as Russia is still a huge player there, and we see making movements even in advance of the summit, movements in Ukraine in and out, and then triggering responses from the United States. So where do we see ourselves there in terms of the conversation of the in and surrounding areas in the post-Soviet makeup?
This is $1 million question, right? What is United States to do or not to do? What is NATO to do or not to do? So, of course, since the invasion of Crimea, since the war in Donbass, the situation on the Eastern Front of Europe has been very difficult, to say the least. Russia continues to press the point that these are very strategic, important areas for Russian Federation. Despite the fact that, let's say, Ukraine and Georgia voiced their desire to join NATO, Russia has several times mentioned that joining of those countries into NATO is one of its biggest red lines, that Russia completely opposes NATO expansions here. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, especially in with regard to that, do we respect sovereignty and decisions of sovereign nations? Or do we pander to Russia in order to appease it, in order to preserve its red lines? And that is not an easy question, because this is people's lives on the line, quite literally. This means hot conflict, and Ukrainians know it very well, with the war in Donbass that is going on, and with the fears of Russian aggression that they are constantly living with. So to a degree, to which sort of United States, what can United States really do? Tread very carefully. That's what United States can do. It probably was I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you to tell you that Ukrainians are quite disappointed. Ukrainian government is very disappointed and have voiced their disappointment in the result of the NATO summit, as well as the Biden-Putin Summit, and the fact that everything sort of was left as it was. Ukraine was, a lot of much was made out of the fact that neither Georgia nor Ukraine were invited to the NATO summit last 2 weeks ago. NATO had good reasons not to do that, but nonetheless, of course, all sides made a big ado about this. Some politicians in Ukraine and Georgia took it as an offensive thing. Of course, Russian propaganda made it sound that, see, NATO washing their hands of these countries and doesn't even want them there. And yeah, there was a bit of a disappointment that, again, no invitation to join came for Georgia or Ukraine. But at the same time, to remind everyone, NATO has discussed membership for Georgia and Ukraine in 2008. And they sort of laid out a commitment that both Ukraine and Georgia will become members. And what came out of this summit was reaffirmation of that commitment. However, it has to come, that reaffirmation and that possible membership will come with certain expectations that both Georgia and Ukraine must meet. And they know it. Are they disappointed? Yes. But those commitments, they are there for a reason. Those affirmations, they're there for a reason. So the fact that that reaffirmation was there for the possible membership, I think sent a very important message. So that was a very positive thing. Now, on the same note, the news that came out a few days after the summit that the United States was considering holding back on their lethal support for Ukraine, on sort of their military support package, including lethal weapon, probably did not send a very nice message. But at the same time, to be fair, that particular decision was reportedly made before the summit occurred for a number of different reasons. So again, we're going to have to wait and see how that really unfolds. But yes, United States, best thing that they can do is tread carefully and keep reaffirming Ukraine in its support for its territorial sovereignty as much as possible.
And I think that two things in response to that is, number one, it reveals the complexity of this situation and just how complex our international relations are. And then I also think it reveals our knee-jerk reaction of, we expect something to come out of the summit like this.
Correct.
I think that the same way that we expect that there was going to be transactions occur, and that we'd walk away and we'd know who clearly came out on top, who won,
right.
A clear winner, not they actually talked about seeing each other eye to eye and learning where each one of them's positioned, because in a way, President Putin has the advantage of having been in office now for quite some time, and it looks like quite some time longer, where he's dealt with multiple presidents. So there's been sort of a precedent setting in that he's now dealing with President Biden, but before he dealt with Trump, and before he dealt with Obama, and so there's clearly history there all the way back to President Bush. But I think coming out on top, I can't help but in some ways think that perhaps, number one, we see the complexities, but number two, we see maybe some of Biden's messaging being true of democracy's back, America is back, and that maybe democracy is a winner out of this, of we see that clear and present. Because I would point back to talking about ending with Putin. couldn't we make a counter argument that perhaps that was the smarter route to go, having the G7, meeting with NATO, getting the backing? Although Biden's there representing the United States, it looked like he had a lot of supporters around him going into that meeting. So it sets him up to say the US is not alone in this meeting. Who else is with Russia?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head here. Absolutely. It's this idea that meeting with Putin was the last on the agenda after the meeting with all the allies. It sends a very strong message. I absolutely agree that United States is not alone. United States is not standing in this as, right, Biden speaking for the allies, bringing the message from the allies. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. Who is with Russia? And it's also very interesting sort of to mention this is a counterposition to, let's say, some of the Russian behavior. Because, right, when President Vladimir Putin was actually asked if the meeting was hostile, and he said, no, there was no hostility. We actually were quite amicable, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also worth reminding everyone that few months ago, actually, March or early April, Russian Ministry of International Affairs actually released a list of hostile countries. And guess who was on that list? So talking out of both sides of our mouths, are we? Right? On one hand, saying that United States is a country adversary, unfriendly, quote unquote country, but at the same time, right, praising this non-hostility. Yeah, I think that this type of engagement that Biden did was very important to point out again to Russia that, look, again, like you said, who stands with you? Who are your friends?
Well, I think that brings you back to your check mark of diplomacy. So diplomacy has the clear victory here. We see that back on the stage. And one of our audience members, I think, is picking up on one of the things we were just talking about with Putin having dealt with multiple presidents. And now Biden's a new president. This person's wondering whether or not Putin's making decisions trying to gauge whether or not Biden will be a one-term president, whether he's defeated in 2024 or he decides not to run in 2024. We know some of the challenges ahead with his age. The oldest sitting president at this point and would be seeking re-election. It would be an historic moment. So some doubt whether or not he'll actually run. He seems to be in it and indicating it, but we don't know that he would win. So wondering whether or not Putin might just be playing the waiting game to wait out 4 years and see what happens next. So that's what that person's curious about, saying, could it just benefit him by waiting a couple of years and seeing who he gets to deal with next? Because again, it looks like President Putin's going to be president for the rest of his foreseeable future.
A while, yes. Unless something unforeseen happens, yes, he's there for a long game. That is actually not a bad question, because in some ways it will not come as a surprise to any of you and any of you listening that, of course, from perspective of Putin administration and of course from perspective of sort of Russian perspective on President Biden, yeah, they don't see him as a long-term president. They do not see, and of course they were not supportive of him to start with. Russia has not been supportive of, or not that it really matters what Russia is supportive of or not in American politics, but nonetheless, of course, they preferred to deal with, there was plenty of evidence to that they would have preferred to deal with President Trump rather than continue to deal with Biden. However, it's not to say that President Trump wasn't a disappointment for Vladimir Putin, and if implication of that question is that if, let's say, if not Biden, then who? And if that who is a repeat of the 45th president of the United States, then will we find something else? Very doubtful, right? To the degree to which Russia's paying attention to who's in power in the United States, they still realize that the United States, despite who's in charge, despite who the president is, has a long-standing tradition of foreign policy. And that long-standing tradition of foreign policy, like you said, Putin understands because Biden is his 5th president. So he understands that no matter who's in office, yes, there are certain levers and certain understandings that they can find with different political parties, but nonetheless, there is still an establishment, as it were, of foreign policy in the United States that he's going to have to deal with. So his public here, I don't think necessarily is American audience as much, or, American presidency is his concern as much as his own domestic and international agenda.
Speaking of the complexity, and then speaking of that long history of foreign diplomacy and international relations for the United States, earlier you had mentioned both President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and talked about their interactions with Russia. And that made me think of a recent column from David Ignatius in the Washington Post, where he talked about at that point they seem to be using China to get to Russia in a triangular relationship. Now it's a bit inverted, perhaps, because we see China perhaps being our greatest global competitor in terms of advancing economies in global world powers. Could perhaps this be laying some of that groundwork to get into conversations with China through Russia? We're in the neighborhood, we're opening more doors and trying to talk more. I just love to hear your reaction on that in terms of the complexity of this, of hosting this meeting, having this conversation now, and getting the dialogue started to create that predictability and that stability.
Yeah, so China is, of course, what that American expression, right? A 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. Absolutely, right? You can't avoid that. And this is absolutely, it has been a point of conversation whether or not now the tables have not turned, right? If before Nixon might have used China as a way of leveraging that relationship with Russia, and whether of the USSR at the time, and whether or not Russia now is playing that very same role in the relationship between China and the United States. I'm hard pressed to actually buy that argument all the way. I can see the logic behind it, but I am hard pressed to think that Russia can be used as a chip by United States like that in a China game. Russia has, it's very, especially under Vladimir Putin's administration for sure, it has strategic moments. And what is more, what we've seen, that Russia has been moving closer and closer to finding their own relationship with China. To say that there is no conflicts, plenty between China and Russia in their relations. But nonetheless, there's quite a few things that connect them. And speaking of that question you asked Russia, who your friends are, this is what Russia really would like to say, that, it's me and what army? It's us and Chinese, right? It's that army. So, and to some degree, yeah, China will play a huge role here. And so in China really is maybe, right, who's the winner here, really, in this conversation.
So maybe China comes out on top for all of
Perhaps,
this. And
perhaps.
so back to, again, other countries at play here. Earlier you talked about nuclear disarmament, but also, conversations happening between the US and Russia on the Iranian nuclear agreement. And another audience question is asking, will Putin work with, does it seem like Putin will work with the US on a new agreement with Iran?
So will they work? We'll have to, yeah, this is a good question too. It will have to be unfolded in the future, right? The Russians were very critical of the United States withdrawing from that agreement. The conversations might be had. I can't really say that from where I am sitting and what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing from Russian administration right now, I see a lot of push toward that conversation moving forward, but it's not out of the question that it might be one of the areas where the two powers, the two can actually come eye to eye. Middle East more generally, I think, is where the two might come to see more eye to eye, not just in the case of Iran.
And that could be, because I know one of the things we're looking at the calendar now for is the withdrawal of US troops and NATO forces in Afghanistan on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. Also still looking at the destabilization of northern Syria. So there are plenty of other regions that there could be some cooperation. I want to pick up on one more audience question here while we have the audience and we have you. This person was really astute in noticing your ability to help native English speakers understand the meaning of adequate when it comes to the Russian understanding of that word and the weight of that. Curious if there was anything else that stood out to you. We're relying on translations to understand this. Was there something perhaps missed in the translation that we should be paying better attention to? Because I'll admit, I didn't think much of the word adequate when I heard it, but now I'm thinking a lot of it. Anything else we need to be paying attention of that you caught that you can help us understand?
That particular phrase stood out to me quite a bit, actually. Yeah, so I had to bring that up a bit more. But it's always a good idea to sort of double check what Vladimir Putin is talking about. His reliance on one other thing, that he's been relying very much on these Russian aphorisms or Russian sayings when he's speaking to Western public, which also makes me think. What's the purpose of those types of communication? Because if you're not a native Russian speaker, you're probably not gonna understand some of those references, or they might be lost in translation. So for instance, he made that reference in the interview to the NBC again when he said, in one response to one of the questions, he said, if don't blame the mirror if you're ugly, type of thing, right? That was the direct quote. And he said, not to refer to you as the dear journalist, but again, right, this was a very pointed Russian saying, and he's been peppering his speech. Even in his address after the summit, he used several of those types of references. And on one hand, it seems to me that it's, again, he's talking to his own audience. He's not speaking to Western public. That is absolutely a reaffirmation to me in my belief that whatever he can do to persuade the public overseas, the Americans, in terms of their position, his position at least, what he can do, but generally he's speaking to his domestic audience.
And so I want to go back to him speaking to his audience and then President Biden speaking to his audience, because earlier you'd mentioned no joint press conference. We saw that in Helsinki with President Trump, and I think that's where most of us tend to remember back to President Trump then siding with Russians over his own intelligence agencies. What's the message being sent of not holding the joint press conference? And does that benefit one president more than the other not to do that? Or is this, again, just a slow walk of the beginning of a new dialogue with a new US president for a Russian president that's been sitting for 20 plus years?
Well, to my mind, the way that I read this is probably that this is a very conscious choice. And I mean, obviously, it is a very conscious choice because Biden administration requested this ahead of the summit. They also requested, and I'm not sure if audience is very aware of this, that Vladimir Putin arrives before Biden to the summit. And this was also done very strategically because President Biden, again, is a experienced politician. He has met with Vladimir Putin before. And what he also knows that Vladimir Putin has this very theatrical streak in him where he likes to arrive late, making his opponents wait. So in this particular instance, Biden's team negotiated that he arrives 10 minutes early and he waits, right? So speaking of political theater. So this decision about not having a joint conference, I think also was on a very important political message than that diplomatic, I mean, let's be honest with ourselves, diplomacy is theater. Diplomacy is about perceptions. Diplomacy is about sending messages where words will not do, right? Or where words are not alone. So in this particular sense, yes, not holding a joint conference meant that President Biden can control his message. He will not be sort of swayed. It does not show the united front. It again reaffirms that we're not here to reset the relations. We're not here to make friends. We're not here, as he said, to make kumbaya moment. We're here really to see how we can move forward in this conversation. And sort of both had an opportunity to reaffirm their stances. For Vladimir Putin, was this really a big loss or win? He probably wouldn't care, would not have cared less. He looked like he really enjoyed his press conference, if anything.
Well, I think it's strategic too that Biden goes second, giving him the opportunity to then rebut anything
Correct.
that President Putin might have said. But they otherwise both seem to be on the same page, and I think Putin even used the line "speaking the same language." You know, that they seem to be on the same page, speaking the same language, and I think their press conferences afterwards more or less indicated that. Would you agree with that, or do you think that there was some sharp division coming out of it, or things that we should be taking note of what President Putin's saying versus what President Biden's saying?
My take on this is that understanding and that speaking the same language, again, depends on what they are speaking about. Are they Do they agree to sort of disagree? Probably. But do they have the same perceptions of the topics that they are discussing? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. So speaking the same language in the sense that they speak the same language of strength and diplomacy to each other, yeah, as in they, and Putin acknowledged himself, right? He also suggested, and President Biden called Putin a worthy opponent, and President Putin paid the same respect to President Biden, suggesting he's a career politician and knows what he's doing as well. So in that sense, yes, they might speak the same language in the same that they understand that both of them are going to defending the interests of their own nations. That's fantastic. At the same time, do they see eye to eye or speak the same language on issues? I don't think so. Again, the big example of this would be Ukraine and the Minsk agreements. What Vladimir Putin says when he says Minsk agreements in Ukraine, he means one thing. When Ukrainians or Western allies or United States talk about Minsk agreement, they mean a very different thing. So, and again, on human rights, they will never see eye to eye. They will never speak the same language.
And I think that's part of people are wondering what ramifications might come if some of these red lines are crossed, and I think that one of the higher points that seem to grab some headlines and attention is, President Biden's addressing of if something were to happen to Alexei Navalny, if something were to happen to him, there would be consequences. So as we're almost out of time here, I've got to ask you the $64,000 question: what's next? So what should we be watching for? What should we be expecting? And I think help us temper those expectations, because a lot of folks coming out of a summit, again, who won? That's the standard question that reporters are going to ask. They want you to give a 2-second answer of, who was more victorious and can you show me how they won?
Yeah.
But as we wait this out and we now start to see this dialogue happen toward a predictable and stable relationship and dialogue, what should we be watching for? What should we be mindful of, and what can we expect?
What we can expect that both will absolutely act in the interest of their national interests. And what that might involve, it might be doing some hard compromising. It might involve taking way smaller steps than we might expect them to. This might be, again, my message more to your expectations on Ukrainian front and on Georgian front. Patience, because no big steps are going to be made there. What about the human rights record? Also, I don't expect big steps to be taken there either. The legal ramifications, right, that Russians have might have if something happens to, let's say, Alexei Navalny or other opposition leaders in Russia. The problem is that the new constitutional arrangements in Russia has basically made Russian constitution above the international law. There's not much we can do. I hate to be that blunt and then throw a wet blanket on that. But it doesn't mean that, as I said before, that the American president should not continue raising those issues. Annexation of Crimea should by no stretch of imagination become a done deal for anyone, right? Even reaffirmations of the fact that Ukraine still is annexed, that is a legally annexed territory, is a very important message. Give you a little sort of historical tidbit here. I know we're almost out of time, but just food for thought. For instance, the Baltic countries that were illegally annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? By that agreement between Soviets and Germans. The Baltic states never have forgotten it, never have forgiven it, and never stopped referring to themselves as illegally annexed territories, as occupied territories. And most of Western allies and United States also for years and years continued to see the same line. 39 versus 1991 when they finally became independent. However, long time, lots of generations, but the fact that that reaffirmation continued yielded the necessary results. Forgetting those lines, same thing with Crimea. Ceding Crimea to Russia, even for a second, saying it's a done deal, huge mistake. So even these little things add up to something very big in diplomatic world and in the greatest span of history. So don't expect big things, but little things, don't underestimate them either.
Dr. Lena Sarsko-Harned, there was so much that we left that we can still pick up and have new conversations. Let's not wait until another summit. Let's get back together. There's Nord Stream 2. We can talk about that. We can talk certainly more about Ukraine. And of course, we can talk about the ongoing relationships between the United States and Russia. So let's get you back here soon. We can continue this conversation. But thank you for sharing your insights, knowledge, and analysis with us here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me as always.
And of course, a big thanks to all of you watching along at home. Thank you for tuning in. These programs and discussions and the exchange of information and ideas would not be possible without you. Folks, for more information about the JES, do visit our website, jeserie.org. There you're going to find videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand and publications, including reports, essays, timely writings, as well as information about other JES initiatives, such as our Civic Leadership Academy and Ramey Fellows Program, and of course, upcoming programs. When we get Lena back again, that'll be up there. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speg, and be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.